The global order rests on a foundation most never see. It is not built on treaties or borders, but on the invisible architecture of currency settlement. For the last 50 years, the engine of modern geopolitics has been the petrodollar, a system where energy security is purchased exclusively in United States dollars. This arrangement granted Washington the ability to finance deficits without consequence, to project naval power into every ocean, and to wield economic sanctions as a primary tool of statecraft. But consider the fragility of this reality. History is not a straight line. It is a series of contingent choices, any one of which could have shifted the center of gravity from the Atlantic to the Pacific. What if the global oil trade had been denominated in the Petro-Yuan from the very inception of the modern monetary system? This is not merely a question of exchange rates or trade balances. It is a question of hegemony. In this scenario, the liquidity that fuels global commerce flows through Shanghai rather than New York. The strategic leverage that comes from controlling the world's reserve currency shifts to East Asia, altering the incentives for war, the structure of alliances, and the development patterns of the global South. The United States loses its exorbitant privilege, forced to balance its books through production rather than printing. China assumes the burden of the hegemon, managing the stability of the global commons while securing its own energy lifelines. To understand this alternate timeline, we must examine the mechanics of monetary power. We must trace how the demand for oil creates the demand for currency, and how that demand translates into political influence. We will explore the divergence point where the post-war order took a different turn, analyzing the immediate economic shocks and the long-term strategic realignments that would follow. This is a study in counterfactual geopolitics, grounded in economic theory and historical precedent. The goal is not to predict the future, but to understand the present by examining the paths not taken. The following analysis explores the implications of a world where the blood of empire flowed in yuan. To comprehend the magnitude of this alternate history, one must first establish the mechanical reality of the existing order. The modern international monetary system was constructed in 1944 at Bretton Woods, establishing the United States dollar as the central reserve currency, initially convertible to gold. However, the structural integrity of this system fractured in 1971, when the gold convertibility was suspended. The United States faced a critical vulnerability. Without gold backing, global demand for the dollar could evaporate, triggering severe inflation and a collapse of American purchasing power. Washington required a new commodity anchor to sustain currency valuation. The solution emerged through the 1974 U.S.-Saudi Joint Commission. In a strategic alignment of interests, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia agreed to price all oil exports exclusively in United States dollars and to recycle surplus petroleum revenue into U.S. Treasury securities. In exchange, the United States provided military hardware and security guarantees to the Saudi monarchy. This arrangement created a recursive demand loop. Every nation requiring energy was forced to acquire dollars, thereby generating constant demand for the currency regardless of the underlying performance of the American economy. This phenomenon, known as the exorbitant privilege, allowed the United States to run persistent trade deficits funded by foreign capital. It transformed the dollar from a national currency into a global public good, underwritten by American naval power. This is the baseline reality. It is a system of mutual dependence where energy security is inextricably linked to monetary sovereignty. Any alteration to this framework necessitates a fundamental reimagining of the mid-20th century geopolitical landscape. To construct a plausible Petro-Yuan timeline, we must address the primary historical constraint. In reality, the Chinese economy of the 1940s and 50s was agrarian, isolated, and its currency was non-convertible. A reserve currency requires deep capital markets, rule of law, and industrial output to back valuation. Therefore, the point of divergence cannot rest solely on a monetary agreement in the 1970s. It must originate in the Reconstruction era following the Second World War. In this alternate timeline, assume a scenario where the Chinese Civil War concludes with a negotiated coalition or a pragmatic administration that prioritizes economic integration over ideological purity. This allows for an East Asian Marshall Plan, where Western capital flows into Chinese infrastructure rather than solely into Japan or Europe. By the time the 1973 oil shock occurs, China is not the closed economy of our timeline, but an emerging industrial hub with the capacity to absorb surplus capital through goods production rather than financial instruments. When OPEC nations seek stability amidst the collapse of Bretton Woods, they look not to a stagflating United States, but to a high-growth Chinese market. The divergence is cemented when Riyadh and Beijing signed the Energy Industrial Accord. Instead of recycling petrodollars into U.S. Treasury debt, surplus oil revenue is exchanged for Chinese manufactured goods, rail infrastructure, and technology transfers. This shifts the anchor of the global economy. The yuan becomes convertible, backed not by gold, but by the productive capacity of the world's largest labor force. This trigger event is critical because it changes the nature of the hegemonic bargain. The United States offered security and debt absorption. China offers development and industrial capacity. This fundamental shift in value proposition alters the strategic calculus for every nation dependent on energy imports. The immediate consequence of this monetary shift is a fundamental restructuring of global liquidity requirements. Central banks across Europe and Asia can no longer accumulate United States dollars to secure energy imports. Instead, they must acquire yuan reserves. This creates an instantaneous demand shock for Chinese currency, forcing Beijing to manage a massive influx of foreign capital. To facilitate this, China must accelerate capital account convertibility, opening its financial markets to foreign investors much earlier than in the historical baseline. This liquidity shift alters the balance of payments for every industrialized nation. Japan and Western Europe, previously able to settle trade imbalances in dollars, must now export goods and services directly to China to earn the currency required for oil. The transatlantic trade axis weakens, replaced by a trans-Eurasian flow of capital and commodities. For the United States, the loss of reserve currency status triggers an immediate contraction in fiscal flexibility. Without the exorbitant privilege, Washington can no longer finance persistent budget deficits through foreign debt accumulation at suppressed interest rates. The cost of borrowing rises sharply as global demand for Treasury securities evaporates. This forces a painful domestic adjustment. The United States must either reduce military spending and social entitlements or increase domestic savings and production to pay for energy imports in a foreign currency. The era of consuming more than what is produced ends abruptly. Inflationary pressures mount as the dollar depreciates against the yuan, increasing the cost of imported goods for American consumers. The economic hegemony that underwrote the American security guarantee begins to fray under the weight of financial reality. Conversely, China faces the burden of the hegemon. The influx of Petro-Yuan reserves creates upward pressure on the currency valuation, threatening the competitiveness of Chinese exports. Beijing must engage in aggressive recycling of these surplus funds. Instead of purchasing low-yield government debt, Chinese capital flows into global infrastructure projects and resource development to maintain liquidity in the system. This creates a new form of dependency. Recipient nations become indebted to Chinese development banks rather than Western institutions. However, this rapid expansion introduces systemic risk. The Chinese financial system, suddenly tasked with allocating global capital, lacks the institutional depth to manage such volume efficiently. Misallocation of capital becomes a significant vulnerability, potentially leading to asset bubbles within the Sinocentric financial sphere. The organization of the petroleum exporting countries also undergoes a strategic transformation. Surplus oil revenue is no longer parked in Western financial centers but is exchanged for industrial capacity and infrastructure development. Saudi Arabia and its allies accelerate their own modernization through Chinese technology transfers rather than Western military integration. This reduces their political reliance on Washington. The security guarantee that previously stabilized the Gulf region is replaced by a commercial partnership focused on development. While this reduces immediate geopolitical tension, it removes the unilateral leverage the United States previously held over global energy supplies. The global financial system becomes multipolar much earlier, characterized by competing currency blocks rather than a single dominant reserve asset. The stability of this new order depends entirely on China's ability to manage the impossible trinity of monetary policy, without triggering a crisis of confidence. The systemic shifts extend far beyond balance sheets and currency reserves. When the foundation of global trade changes, the institutions built upon that foundation must adapt or become obsolete. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, headquartered in Washington and historically dominated by United States voting shares, face an immediate legitimacy crisis. Member nations demand restructuring of governance to reflect the new economic reality. In this alternate timeline, Shanghai emerges as a co-equal financial center, hosting alternative multilateral institutions that operate parallel to the Bretton Woods system. Special drawing rights are recalibrated to weight the yuan as the primary reserve asset, diminishing the influence of Western economic policy on developing nations. This institutional fragmentation reshapes the global development model. The Washington Consensus, which emphasized privatization, deregulation, and fiscal austerity as conditions for lending, loses its monopoly on economic orthodoxy. In its place, the Beijing Consensus gains prominence. This model prioritizes state-led infrastructure investment, long-term planning, and sovereign-to-focus conditionality. Developing nations no longer face pressure to liberalize capital accounts or democratize political systems to access credit. Instead, they negotiate bilateral development packages tied to resource access and trade preferences. This shift alters the trajectory of political development across the global south, reinforcing authoritarian stability over democratic transition as the preferred path to economic growth. The military implications are equally profound. Naval power projection follows currency flows. In the historical baseline, the United States Navy secured global sea lanes to protect the dollar-denominated trade system. In this alternate reality, the People's Liberation Army Navy assumes responsibility for protecting energy routes through the Strait of Malacca and the Indian Ocean. This requires a fundamental restructuring of military basing agreements. Ports across Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East opened to Chinese naval access much earlier than in our timeline. The United States, constrained by fiscal pressures, retrenches from forward deployment. NATO loses its strategic coherence as European members, dependent on yuan-settled energy, pursue independent security arrangements with Beijing. The alliance system fragments into regional security frameworks organized around trade corridors rather than ideological blocs. A critical feedback loop emerges between currency demand and military expenditure. The hegemon must spend disproportionately to maintain the security infrastructure that underpins trust in its currency. China faces rising defense budgets to protect shipping lanes, while the United States, freed from this burden, redirects resources toward domestic consolidation. This creates a paradox. China gains monetary dominance but inherits the security costs that accompany it. The United States loses financial privilege but gains fiscal space for internal investment. Over time, this dynamic may produce a more balanced distribution of global power, or it may trigger conflict as the declining hegemon attempts to disrupt the rising order before it consolidates. The technological sphere experiences parallel realignment. Standards for telecommunications, energy infrastructure, and transportation systems converge around Chinese specifications. The ISO frameworks that govern global interoperability reflect East Asian industrial preferences rather than Western ones. This creates path dependency. Once a nation invests in Chinese standard rail, power grids, or digital networks, switching costs become prohibitive. Technology becomes a tool of lock-in, reinforcing the monetary architecture through physical infrastructure. The Internet itself may fragment earlier, with separate digital ecosystems emerging around different regulatory and technical standards. This technological bifurcation reduces the soft power reach of Western media and information systems, limiting the cultural influence that historically accompanied economic dominance. Financial architecture evolves to accommodate the new order. Settlement systems alternative to SWIFT emerge in the 1980s rather than the 21st century, reducing the effectiveness of unilateral sanctions as a policy tool. The United States loses the ability to weaponize access to the dollar clearing system. This diminishes American leverage in diplomatic negotiations, but also reduces the incentive for adversaries to develop parallel systems through covert means. Transparency increases as transactions flow through standardized channels, but privacy decreases as the dominant power gains unprecedented visibility into global capital flows. The balance between financial security and financial sovereignty shifts decisively toward the hegemon. These second-order effects demonstrate that monetary systems are not neutral mechanisms. They encode power relationships into the everyday operations of commerce and finance. Changing the currency of oil changes the incentives for war, the structure of institutions, and the trajectory of technological development. The systemic shifts create a world that is recognizable yet fundamentally altered, where the center of gravity has moved without the catastrophe of total war. This is the nature of hegemonic transition, through economic means rather than military conquest. By the turn of the 21st century, the long-term global order has solidified into a sinocentric system of managed globalization. The hegemon is no longer a maritime power projecting force through alliance networks, but a continental power projecting influence through infrastructure connectivity. The hub-and-spoke model of supply chains radiates from East Asia, making China the central node through which most global value chains must pass. This structural position grants Beijing veto power over industrial production worldwide. Nations are integrated not merely through trade agreements but through physical compatibility with Chinese standard gauge railways, energy grids, and digital payment systems. This creates a form of lock-in that is far more durable than military basing rights. To exit the system requires rebuilding entire national infrastructures, a cost prohibitive enough to ensure long-term compliance. The nature of globalization itself has diverged significantly from the neoliberal model of the historical baseline. In this timeline, the free movement of capital is restricted. The Beijing consensus prioritizes stability over efficiency, encouraging state-owned enterprises to lead development rather than private multinational corporations. Financial markets are less volatile but also less dynamic. Innovation is directed towards state goals such as energy security and logistical capacity rather than consumer software or financial engineering. The result is a world that is materially robust but culturally homogenized around the norms of the hegemon. The concept of universal human rights recedes in international discourse, replaced by a framework of collective development and non-interference. Sovereignty is interpreted as the right of states to manage internal affairs without external moral judgment, provided they adhere to the economic protocols of the reserve currency system. The United States occupies a distinctly different position in this mature order. Stripped of the ability to export inflation, it has become a regionally focused power. The North American economy is more self-sufficient, with higher domestic manufacturing capacity born out of necessity. However, its geopolitical reach is confined to the Western Hemisphere. Without the dollar privilege to fund forward deployment, Washington maintains a fortress economy strategy. It remains a technological and cultural power, but it lacks the systemic leverage to shape outcomes in Europe or Asia. The transatlantic alliance dissolves into a series of bilateral trade deals as European nations pivot to secure energy and credit from the East. The world is effectively bifurcated into a yuan zone encompassing Eurasia and Africa, and a dollar zone encompassing the Americas, with limited convertibility between the two. Currency competition stabilizes into an oligopoly rather than a monopoly. While the yuan is the primary reserve asset, regional currencies like the euro or a hypothetical Asian currency unit serve as secondary settlement mechanisms for local trade. This reduces the risk of a single point of failure but complicates global liquidity management. Financial architecture evolves to accommodate this fragmentation. Digital state currencies emerge earlier, allowing for programmable money that enforces trade compliance automatically. The anonymity of cross-border transactions disappears, replaced by a transparent ledger monitored by the hegemon to prevent sanctions evasion and capital flight. This increases the efficiency of tax collection and regulatory enforcement, but eliminates the possibility of financial privacy for nations or individuals within the system. Development patterns across the global south reflect the priorities of the new order. Africa and Latin America see rapid infrastructure development funded by resource-backed loans. Ports, dams, and highways are constructed at a pace unseen in the historical baseline, but they come with strings attached. Debt distress is managed through restructuring agreements that grant long-term lease rights over strategic assets rather than through austerity measures. This creates a modern form of mercantilism where resource extraction is exchanged for industrial capacity. The quality of life in developing nations improves in terms of material infrastructure, but political pluralism often stagnates as incumbent regimes are bolstered by external credit without conditionalities for democratic reform. Ultimately, the long-term stability of this order depends on the ability of the hegemon to manage the contradictions of its own success. As China accumulates surplus capital, it must find outlets for investment abroad to prevent domestic overheating. This leads to an imperial overreach where the cost of maintaining the global system begins to outweigh the benefits of currency seigniorage. Meanwhile, the excluded powers, primarily the United States and its regional partners, focus on asymmetric technologies to offset conventional disadvantages. The world avoids a single unipolar moment but enters a prolonged period of systemic competition. The peace that exists is not based on shared values but on mutual economic exhaustion and the high cost of decoupling. This is the enduring legacy of the Petro-Yuan, a world that is more integrated materially, yet more divided politically, bound together by the strict discipline of currency settlement. In the Middle East, The strategic calculus shifts from security guarantees to development partnerships. In the historical baseline, the United States exchanged military protection for oil pricing stability, embedding American naval assets in the Persian Gulf and intervening in regional conflicts to maintain flow. In the Petro-Yuan timeline, Beijing offers a different bargain. The focus is not on military bases but on industrial zones, desalination plants, and rail connectivity linking the Gulf to Western China. Saudi Arabia and Iran navigate this landscape with greater autonomy, playing the hegemon off against regional rivals without fear of direct regime change operations. The result is a more stable but less democratized region. Conflicts are managed through economic leverage rather than military coercion. Oil production remains high, but the profits are invested in Asian equity markets and infrastructure bonds rather than Western debt. The social contract in these monarchies evolves towards state capitalism, mirroring the economic model of the reserve currency issuer. Across Europe, the transatlantic bond weakens under the pressure of energy dependency. Without the dollar as the mandatory medium for oil settlement, European central banks accumulate yuan reserves, tying their monetary policy closer to Beijing than to Washington. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization loses its strategic coherence as the United States, constrained by fiscal reality, reduces its forward presence on the continent. European powers pursue strategic autonomy, developing independent nuclear deterrence and negotiating bilateral energy security agreements with Eurasia. The European Union becomes a regulatory superpower but remains a strategic subordinate to the Asian financial core. Industrial policy shifts to align with Chinese standards, ensuring compatibility with the primary market for exports. This alignment creates prosperity but limits political sovereignty. Brussels finds itself unable to sanction Beijing without triggering energy rationing at home. The continent becomes a bridge between the Sinocentric core and the Atlantic periphery, benefiting from trade but lacking the power to dictate terms. In Africa, the development trajectory accelerates but follows a distinct path of resource mercantilism. The International Monetary Fund loses its monopoly on crisis lending, replaced by Chinese development banks offering resource-backed infrastructure loans. Structural adjustment programs demanding privatization and austerity are replaced by contracts requiring long-term resource access in exchange for roads, ports, and power grids. The physical landscape of the continent transforms rapidly. Rail lines connect mineral-rich interiors to coastal hubs designed for export to Asia. However, this comes with a loss of policy space. Debt distress is resolved not through forgiveness but through asset leases, granting the creditor nation control over strategic ports and mines for decades. Political elites are bolstered by this external support, reducing the pressure for democratic accountability. The region integrates deeply into the global economy but occupies a peripheral position as a supplier of raw materials and a consumer of finished goods, locked into a vertical division of labor dictated by the reserve currency power. Within the United States, the internal economic model undergoes a forced transformation. Stripped of the ability to import capital cheaply, the nation can no longer sustain a consumption-led economy. The trade deficit closes not through policy choice but through currency necessity. Manufacturing returns to the Rust Belt, driven by the need to produce exports capable of earning foreign currency for energy purchases. The society becomes more savings-oriented and less indebted. Income inequality may decrease as financialization loses prominence relative to industrial production. However, the standard of living adjusts downward relative to the historical baseline, as cheap consumer goods imported from Asia become more expensive. Politically, the nation turns inward. Isolationism becomes a pragmatic necessity rather than an ideological choice. The military shrinks to a hemispheric defense force. Innovation continues but focuses on defense and energy independence, rather than global consumer platforms. The United States remains a wealthy nation, but it is a wealthy fortress, disconnected from the levers of global governance it once built. These regional divergences illustrate the pervasive reach of monetary architecture. The currency used to price oil determines who builds the roads, who guards the seas, and who writes the rules. In the Middle East, it buys autonomy from Western intervention. In Europe, it buys stability at the cost of sovereignty. In Africa, it buys infrastructure at the cost of long-term resource control. In the United States, it buys fiscal discipline at the cost of global influence. No region remains untouched. The Petro-Yuan system does not merely change bank balances. It rewrites the social contracts of nations. It creates a world that is more materially connected but politically fragmented, where power is measured not by the size of an army but by the depth of a currency market. This regional analysis confirms that the choice of reserve currency is the single most significant determinant of geopolitical structure in the modern era. To understand the strategic logic of this alternate timeline, one must apply the foundational theories of international relations. From the perspective of political realism, power is the primary currency of statecraft, and monetary hegemony is a force multiplier. In this scenario, the transition from a unipolar American order to a Sino-centric system represents a classic power transition. Realist theory suggests that such shifts are inherently unstable, often leading to conflict as the declining hegemon attempts to preserve its status against the rising power. However, because this transition occurs through monetary integration rather than direct military confrontation, the security dilemma is managed through economic statecraft. The United States loses the ability to project power globally due to fiscal constraints, while China gains the burden of providing public goods such as sea lane security. This aligns with the theory of hegemonic stability, which posits that a single dominant power is necessary to maintain the open international economic system. In this timeline, Beijing assumes that role, but unlike the United States, it prioritizes regime security and non-interference over liberal democratic expansion. This creates a realist order based on spheres of influence rather than universal alliances. Liberal institutionalism offers a different lens, focusing on interdependence and cooperation. In the historical baseline, economic interdependence was expected to reduce the likelihood of conflict through the costs of disruption. In the Petro-Yuan timeline, interdependence is even higher, but it is asymmetric. Nations are dependent on China for liquidity and infrastructure, while China is dependent on them for resource access. This creates a relationship of mutual vulnerability. Liberal theory would suggest that the dense network of trade and financial institutions should prevent major power war. However, the weaponization of this interdependence changes the dynamic. Access to the yuan clearing system becomes a tool of coercion, similar to how the United States utilized the dollar in our timeline. The difference lies in the conditionality. Western institutions historically demanded political liberalization in exchange for integration. The alternative institutions in this scenario demand political loyalty and resource access. Peace is maintained not through shared values but through shared economic necessity. This validates the liberal argument that institutions matter, but challenges the assumption that they inevitably lead to democratization. Constructivist theory highlights the role of ideas, norms, and identity in shaping international outcomes. The dominance of the petrodollar reinforced norms of neoliberalism, individual rights, and Western-style governance. A Petro-Yuan hegemony diffuses different norms. The concept of sovereignty is redefined to emphasize non-interference and state-led development. Human rights discourse loses its universal claim, replaced by a framework of collective economic rights and stability. This normative shift alters the identity of states within the system. Developing nations no longer view themselves as aspiring Western democracies, but as partners in a multipolar development network. The social construction of power changes from military capability to infrastructural connectivity. A nation's status is determined by its integration into the Belt and Road Network rather than its alliance with Washington. This ideological shift is perhaps the most enduring consequence, as it changes the expectations of legitimate state behavior. What was once considered authoritarianism is reframed as efficient governance. What was once considered interventionism is reframed as security cooperation. Game theory provides the mechanical explanation for why this system persists once established. The choice of reserve currency is a coordination game with high switching costs. Once the global network converges on the yuan, no single actor has the incentive to deviate. To switch back to the dollar or another currency would incur prohibitive transaction costs and liquidity losses. This creates a Nash equilibrium where the system remains stable even if participants are dissatisfied. The network effects of the currency create a lock-in mechanism similar to a technology standard. Furthermore, the trust required for fiat currency is modeled as a repeated game. China must maintain the value of the yuan over time to ensure continued participation. If it abuses its position through excessive inflation or arbitrary sanctions, trust erodes, and the system collapses. Therefore, the hegemon is constrained by the need to maintain credibility. This explains why even a non-democratic hegemon must adhere to certain economic rules. The logic of the game forces discipline upon the player, regardless of their domestic political structure. Synthesizing these theories reveals the winners and losers of this strategic rearrangement. The primary winners are the state apparatuses of the hegemon and its closest partners, who gain access to cheap capital and security guarantees. The primary losers are actors who rely on the openness of the liberal order, such as non-governmental organizations and dissident movements who lose external leverage. The global system gains stability in terms of reduced unilateral military intervention, but loses resilience due to the concentration of financial power. The risk of systemic collapse increases because there are fewer redundant mechanisms to absorb shocks. Ultimately, the strategic analysis confirms that monetary systems are not merely technical arrangements but expressions of political power. They encode the preferences of the hegemon into the daily operations of the global economy. Whether through the realist lens of power transition, the liberal lens of interdependence, or the constructivist lens of norms, the conclusion remains the same. The currency of settlement determines the architecture of authority. The exploration of a Petro-Yuan hegemony reveals a fundamental truth about international politics. Monetary systems are not neutral technical arrangements. They are geopolitical tools that shape the distribution of power, the structure of alliances, and the trajectory of human development. In this alternate timeline, the world is not necessarily better or worse, but it is distinctly different. The center of gravity shifts from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The norms of sovereignty change from liberal interventionism to state-led non-interference. The stability of the global order relies not on shared democratic values but on the mutual necessity of trade settlement. This counterfactual exercise serves as a mirror for the present moment. Current debates regarding de-dollarization and the rise of digital currencies are not merely economic technicalities. They are indicators of potential structural shifts in the global order. Understanding the mechanics of the petrodollar system allows us to recognize the fragility of our current reality. Hegemony is not permanent. It is maintained through the continuous alignment of economic incentives and security guarantees. When those incentives shift, the architecture of power must adapt. Ultimately, the choice of reserve currency determines who holds the leverage in a crisis. It dictates who can borrow without limit and who must balance their books. It decides whose laws govern international commerce and whose navy secures the commons. Whether the future remains unipolar, becomes multipolar, or shifts to a new hegemon depends on these underlying financial currents. The history of money is the history of power. By examining the paths not taken, we gain clarity on the path we are walking. The Petro-Yuan scenario reminds us that the global order is a construct built on choices that could have been otherwise and may yet change again.